They corrected something in you when you were young. What they called a flaw was the only thing about you that was completely real. There was something about you when you were young that made adults uncomfortable, not because you were difficult, because you were different in a way they could not categorize easily. Maybe you felt the tension in a room before anyone spoke. Maybe you saw the solution to something everyone else was still diagnosing. Maybe you cared so deeply about fairness or meaning or connection that the adults around you called it oversensitivity and told you to toughen up. Maybe you were the child who asked why when. Everyone else accepted because that is just how things are. Whatever it was specific. And the response to it was specific too. They did not say your gift was unwelcome. They said you were too much. They said you needed to be more practical, more social, more realistic, more calm. They handed you the correction with warmth, sometimes with genuine love, and you absorbed the correction so thoroughly that by the time you became an adult, you had stopped doing the thing that once came so naturally, it felt like breathing. You called it growing up. You called it learning to fit in. What you actually did was bury the most essential thing you arrived with. And the strange part is that the thing you buried is still there. It never left. It has been expressing itself sideways in your strongest reactions and your deepest frustrations, in the specific things you cannot stop noticing, even when everyone else has moved on. What I'm going to give you in this video is not a personality quiz. It is not a list of types. It is a set of specific observations about your actual behavior, the patterns you cannot help, the reactions that arrive before your thinking does, and those patterns will show you something you have not been told directly. They will show you the function you were born to operate from, the one that was corrected into silence, the one that has been trying to come back ever since. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called psychological types, not as boxes to put people in, as a map of the different ways human beings naturally process reality. He identified 4 primary functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting, and he observed that every person has one that operates as their dominant mode, the one that arrives first, the one that costs the least energy, the one that, when given full permission, produces a quality of clarity and engagement that nothing else in their life quite matches. But here is what most people miss about his work. Jung was not interested in which function you use. He was interested in which function you have been suppressing, because the function that was most criticized in your development is almost always the one closest to your actual gift. The child who saw connections between unrelated things and was told to stop daydreaming grew up dismissing an intuitive function that, when developed, allows them to perceive patterns that most people around them will never notice. The child who needed to understand the logic of everything and was told to stop questioning grew up calling their thinking function overthinking, when what it actually is a capacity for systematic clarity that most environments simply did not know how to use. The child who lived entirely in their body, in sensation in the present moment, and was told to be more focused on the future grew up disconnected from the only thing that ever made them feel genuinely alive. Whatever they corrected in you, that is where the test begins. Not in what you are good at, in what you were punished for being too much of. The test itself is not complicated. It requires honesty, which is harder than it sounds, because some of what it asks you to admit has been uncomfortable to admit for years. The first observation is this: think about the last time you were in a group and something happened that nobody else reacted to but that you could not ignore. Not a big event, something small, a shift in tone, an inconsistency in logic, a feeling in the room that did not match what was being said, a detail that everyone else walked past. What was it? What was the specific thing that your attention locked onto that nobody else seemed to register? That involuntary focus, the thing your perception moves toward automatically before your conscious mind has decided to pay attention, is one of the clearest indicators of your dominant function. The feeling type locks onto the emotional shift that just happened under the surface of the conversation. The thinking type catches the logical inconsistency in the argument before the speaker has finished making it. The intuitive type senses the direction things are heading before the evidence is there to support the sense. The sensing type registers the physical detail, the specific object out of place, the quality of the space, the thing that is concretely different from how it was before. You have been doing this your entire life, automatically, without choosing to. That automaticity is not quirk, that is function. That is the specific way your psyche has been trying to be useful in every environment it has entered, whether or not the environment knew how to receive what it was offering. The second observation in the test is about your frustration, specifically the frustration that is disproportionate, the irritation that arrives at full force over something that the people around you consider minor. This is not a flaw in your emotional regulation. This is your dominant function reacting to its own suppression. When a feeling type is in a room where emotion emotions are being dismissed or invalidated. The frustration is not about the specific conversation. It is the accumulated signal of a function that has been told it does not matter. When a thinking type is surrounded by decisions being made on sentiment alone with no structural reasoning, the frustration is not stubbornness. It is the function announcing that it has something necessary to contribute and is being silenced. When an intuitive type is forced to stay in the surface-level detail of a situation, when the pattern underneath is screaming for attention, the restlessness is not immaturity. It is the function straining against the constraint of a context that does not know how to use it. Your strongest frustrations are almost always the map. They show you where your function is most needed and most consistently denied access. And here is what that means practically. The environments that frustrate you the most are not necessarily the wrong environments. They are the environments where your function has been given the least permission. And the question that follows from that is not how do I find better environments? It is what would change if I stopped waiting for permission and simply led from the function I was born with. The third observation requires the most courage. Think about the person in your life or across your life who most consistently makes you feel inadequate. Not the person who is cruel, the person whose specific competence or way of being has quietly produced in you the particular discomfort of comparison. Notice what the comparison is actually about. Not in general terms, specifically, what is the quality in them that triggers the inadequacy? Jung called this the inferior function, the function that is least developed in you because it received the least permission to develop, and the shadow it casts over your self-assessment is specific and recognizable once you see it. The person who was trained to feel rather than think will often feel inadequate around the person who reasons clearly and quickly. The person who was trained to think rather than feel will often feel inadequate around the person whose emotional presence fills a room effortlessly. But here is what Jung observed that changes everything about this. The inadequacy you feel around someone else's inferior function is not evidence of a deficiency in you. It is evidence of a gift. Because your dominant function and your sense of inadequacy around someone else's are almost always opposite ends of the same axis. The person who feels inadequate around the calm, logical reasoner is almost certainly operating from a feeling, function of uncommon depth. The person who feels inadequate around the emotionally expressive and connected person is almost certainly operating from a thinking, function of unusual precision. The thing you envy in someone else is almost always the shadow of the thing you were built to do. You have been looking at the wrong end of the comparison. What the test ultimately reveals is not a category, it is a direction. It tells you where to stop apologizing, where to stop softening the signal of your own perception before you bring it into rooms that have not asked for it, where to stop treating the function you were born with as a liability that requires management and start treating it as the specific contribution you were actually sent here to make. Jung believed that a person who lives against their dominant function produces a particular kind of suffering that is almost impossible to diagnose from outside. It looks like vague dissatisfaction. It looks like competence without fulfillment. It looks like a person who is doing everything correctly and still feels, in the quiet moments, that something essential is being wasted. That suffering is not a mystery. It is a message. The function is waiting. It has been waiting since the first time someone told you that the most natural, thing about you was too much. It is still waiting, not with urgency, with the specific patience of something that knows it is irreplaceable. The question the test leaves you with is not which type you are. It is simpler and harder than that. What would your life look like if you stopped treating your most natural response to the world as the thing that needs the most correction?